Hello everyone, welcome back, and I'm glad to be back. I was on a little bit of a break last month because I had some stuff happening in my house. I had my dad working from home for a little bit as we sorted out issues with cars and stuff. So that's one of the downsides of still living at home, is that you have to deal with certain interferences and you have to deal with your family and basically work around their schedule and everything. But I am back and I will be doing another Read Aloud series on the channel until I work around to doing some more scripted content. Now, if you guys can hear from the sound of my voice, I'm a little bit congested. It's just due to the changes in the air and the temperature is dropping, my immune system is a little bit low. So if I have to stop to cough and blow my nose, I apologize about that in advance. And yeah, that's basically everything that is happening right now. But I have my coffee, my regular coffee with my Starbucks pumpkin spice creamer added into it. So I'm thoroughly prepared, but I'm probably going to end up making myself hot water with lemon and honey before I end up reading the second chapter at some point, because the book that I am going to be reading on this channel, the series that I'm going to be reading next, is The Infernal Devices by Cassandra Clare, which is the Mortal Instruments prequel series, and we are starting with the very first in the series, Clockwork Angel. Now, before we begin the reading, I just have to make the disclaimer that, of course, I don't own any of the text being presented here, nor am I trying to present any of the text as my own. This is all simply a read aloud that I'm doing on this channel for entertainment purposes, and of course, everything is in fair use, and of course, I acknowledge that everything in this book belongs to the Queen of Fantasy herself, Cassandra Clare. So this is The Clockwork Angel, Infernal Devices by Cassandra Clare. And the first thing that you see is a map of London for Shadowhunters that includes the London Institute and includes a whole lot of stuff here, as well as a little foreword that Cassie had put into the book. So I'm going to read the foreword as well as the prologue. So this is the foreword right here. For many years during the time I've been a writer, people have asked me if I get inspiration for my books from my dreams. My response has always been that I wish that I did. It seems like such a fun way to get story ideas. Dream something and wake up compelled to put the story on paper. Unfortunately, the only real dreams I ever have about my characters and stories are nonsensical. All my characters are in front of me in line at the grocery store and have too many items in their carts, which makes the genesis of the idea I had for the Infernal Devices pretty unusual. It wasn't a dream, but it was a daydream. I was in London on a trip to promote City of Bones, the first book of the Shadowhunters Chronicles. I was crossing Blackfriars Bridge, which is a lovely old bridge in the city of London over the River Thames. It was a gray, cloudy day, and mist was drifting along the bridge. I leaned against the parapet and looked down at the water. I thought about how the bridge had stood for so many years, and of all that it must have witnessed. Slowly, the image of a girl with brown hair and a boy dressed in Victorian clothing came into my mind, and as I pictured them there on the bridge, I imagined a strange army of clockwork monsters hidden in the shadows, waiting to pounce. I went home feeling unsettled and inspired. Slowly, the story of Tessa, Jem, and Will began to take shape in my mind. I chose the location of the London Institute for its proximity to Blackfriars Bridge, for I always knew the bridge would be central to the tale. After much wandering around London, using a map dated 1879, which led to a lot of getting lost, I decided the institute would be St. Bride's Church off Fleet Street, a gorgeous church gutted by firebombs during the Blitz. I chose 1878 because it was a time of transition from an old England to a new England. There was regular train service, there was gaslight, there were sewers, and yet the time period retained the graciousness and beauty of the past. It seemed like a wonderful era in which to set a story about three young people learning who they are and all they are capable of, especially when it came to the story of a young girl learning she is destined for more than an arranged marriage, that she is destined for an extraordinary love. I believe that historical fiction is the closest thing we have to time travel. I wanted to feel as much as I could that I was living and breathing the time period of the infernal devices. So I set myself a project. For 6 months, I've read nothing but books set in the mid and late Victorian era. It was research by immersion. Soon I started to imagine that I could see horse-drawn carriages instead of cars, that I could smell the Thames River and hear the bow bells. I wanted my readers to feel that the past was accessible, so the characters of a bygone time's pain and joy would seem real and true. It was a time obsessed with death, in which diseases, which are now cured easily, were rife, and sicknesses we now understand seemed as mysterious as the corrupting touch of a demon. The real world, as it was then, slotted neatly into my already imagined world of the shadow hunters, demon hunters, and magic users, and gave it a new depth and richness, creating a hero who could see and talk to imploring ghosts, and another who was condemned to die young of a fatal demonic illness, no matter how desperate the efforts to save him, just as in reality victims of consumption, sickened and died without penicillin. The Bronte family, who produced Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre, were decimated by consumption, and to mark my respect for and debt to their work, I named the head of the London Institute, Charlotte Bronwell, after 2 of the Bronte siblings. It was a difficult time for a woman to have authority in the Shadowhunter world and the mundane world, but Charlotte manages it. Tessa, Charlotte, Sophie, and Jessamine are all heroines who I adore, coping with the prejudice of a time more difficult for women than our own in a way that I hoped would also resonate with the oppression women still face today. I immersed myself in books to write this series, and in this series, 2 of the characters also find inspiration and comfort in books. Tessa and Will bond over Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, in which one of the heroes considers himself a soul doomed to wickedness. Will thinks he too is doomed to be corrupt and unloved. Over the course of the books, he learns how wrong he was. His best friend, James Carstairs, who is dying, believes that he is fated to die without love, like the poet Keats, whom his character is partially based on. Both Will and Jem love each other. They are blood brothers, but despite that love, they have no hope. In Tessa, they both find their salvation because Tessa believes in hope, not just because she is stalwart and a heroine, but also because she has discovered hope in books. Tessa is a bookworm. She doesn't only love classics by the Brontes and Dickens, but the many novels of her time that I read during my months-long reading project. She reads voraciously in the same way I did, books considered both high and lowbrow, and she gains enjoyment from both kinds. She learns she has the power to shapeshift, reflecting our real-life ability to slip inside the skin of fictional characters when we read. I wanted to write a heroine who was invested in books as much as I was, and as I knew my readers were. A girl who learned that adventure was possible from books, that romance was potentially as wonderful as it was painful, that courage and kindness would carry her through, and that she could be marvelously transformed. I wanted every girl reading the Infernal Devices to feel that she could be the heroine of a novel. Maybe even this one. And of course, she always puts a piece of poetry into her works. For example, in Shadowhunters, The Mortal Instruments, it was the Shadowhunters nursery rhyme of black for hunting through the night, for mourning the colors white, gold for a bride in her wedding gown, and red to call enchantment down, da-da-da-da-da. But this is the Thames River song. A note of salt slips in and the river rises, darkening to the color of tea, swelling to meet the green. Above its banks, the cogs and wheels of monstrous machines clank and spin. The ghost within vanishes into its coils, whispering mysteries. Each tiny golden cog has teeth. Each great wheel moves. A pair of hands which take the water from the river, devour it, convert it into steam, coerce the great machine to run on the force of its dissolution. Gently, the tide is rising, corrupting the mechanism. Salt, rust, and silt, slowing the gears. Down at the banks, the iron tanks sway into their moorings with the hollow boom of a gigantic bell, of drum and cannon, which cry out in a tongue of thunder, and the river rolls under. Clock. So that was the preface, or that was the foreword. Now we have the prologue or the preface. The prologue starts it this way. London, April 1878. The demon exploded in a shower of ichor and guts. William Herondale jerked back the dagger he was holding, but it was too late. The vicious acid of the demon's blood had already begun to eat away at the shining blade. He swore and tossed the weapon aside. It landed in a filthy puddle and commenced smoldering like a doused match. The demon itself, of course, had vanished, dispatched back to whatever hellish world it had come from, though not without leaving a mess behind. "Jem!" Will called, turning around. "Where are you? Did you see that? Killed it with one blow! Not bad, eh?" But there was no answer to Will's shout. His hunting partner had been standing behind him in the damp and crooked street a few moments before, guarding his back. Will was positive, but now Will was alone in the shadows. He frowned in annoyance. It was much less fun showing off without Jem to show off too. He glanced behind him to where the street narrowed into a passage that gave onto the black, heaving water of the Thames in the distance. Through the gap, Will could see the dark outlines of docked ships, a forest of masts, like a leafless orchard. No Jem there. Perhaps he had gone back to Narrow Street in search of better illumination. With a shrug, Will headed back the way he had come. Narrow Street cut across Limehouse, between the docks beside the river and the cramped slums spreading west toward Whitechapel. It was as narrow as its name suggested, lined with warehouses and lopsided wooden buildings. At the moment it was deserted. Even the drunks staggering home from the grapes up the road had found somewhere to collapse for the night. Will liked Limehouse, liked the feeling of being on the edge of the world, where ships left each day for unimaginably far ports, that the area was a sailor's haunt, and consequently full of gambling hells, opium dens, and brothels. Didn't hurt either. It was easy to lose yourself in a place like this. He didn't even mind the smell of it. Smoke and rope and tar, foreign spices mixed with the dirty river water smell of the Thames. Looking up and down the the empty street. He scrubbed the sleeve of his coat across his face, trying to rub away the ichor that stung and burned his skin. The cloth came away stained green and black. There was a cut on the back of his hand, too. A nasty one. He could use a healing rune. One of Charlotte's, preferably. She was particularly good at drawing Aratsi's. A shape detached itself from the shadows and moved toward Will. He started forward, then paused. It wasn't Jem, but rather a mundane policeman, wearing a bell-shaped helmet, a heavy overcoat, and a puzzled expression. He stared at Will, or rather through Will. However accustomed Will had become to glamour, it was always strange to be looked through as if he weren't there. Will was seized with the sudden urge to grab the policeman's truncheon and watch while the man flapped around, trying to figure out where it had gone. But Jem had scolded him the few times he'd done that before, and while Will never really could understand Jem's objections to the whole enterprise, it wasn't worth making him upset. With a shrug and a blink, the policeman moved past Will, shaking his head and muttering something under his breath about swearing off the djinn before he truly started seeing things. Will stepped aside to let the man pass, then raised his voice to shout, James Costairs! Jem, where are you, you disloyal bastard? This time, a faint reply answered him. Over here! Follow the witchlight! Will moved toward the sound of Jem's voice. It seemed to be coming from a dark opening between two warehouses. A faint gleam was visible within the shadows, like the darting light of a will-o'-the-wisp. Did you hear me before? That shark's demon thought it could get me with its bloody great pincers, but I cornered it in an alley. Yes, I heard you. The young man appeared who appeared at the mouth of the alley was pale in the lamplight, paler even than he usually was, which was quite pale indeed. He was bareheaded, which drew the eye immediately to his hair. It was an odd bright silver color, like an untarnished shilling. His eyes were the same silver, and his fine-boned face was angular, the slight curve of his eyes the only clue to his heritage. There were dark stains across his white shirt front, and his hands were thickly smeared with red. Will tensed. You're bleeding! What happened? Jem waved away Will's concern. It's not my blood. He turned his head back toward the alley behind him. It's hers. Will glanced past his friend into the thicker shadows of the alley. In the far corner of it was a crumpled shape. Only a shadow in the darkness, but when Will looked closely, he could make out the shape of a pale hand and a wisp of fair hair. A dead woman? Will asked. A mundane? A girl, really. No more than 14. At that, Will cursed with great volume and expression. Jem waited patiently for him to be done. If we'd only happened along a little earlier, Will said finally. That bloody demon! That's a peculiar thing. I don't think this is the demon's work. Jem frowned. Shark's demons are parasites. Brood parasites. It would have wanted to drag its victim back to its lair to lay eggs in her skin while she was still alive. But this girl, she was stabbed repeatedly. And I don't think it was here either. There simply wasn't enough blood in the alley. I think she was attacked elsewhere, and she dragged herself here to die of her injuries. But the shark's demon, I'm telling you, I don't think it was the sharks. I think the sharks was pursuing her, hunting her down for something, or someone else. Sharks have a keen sense of scent, Will allowed. I've heard of warlocks using them to follow the tracks of the missing, and it did seem to be moving with an odd sort of purpose. He looked past Jem, at the pitiful smallness of the crumpled shape in the alley. You didn't find the weapon, did you? Here. Jem drew something from inside his jacket, a knife wrapped in a white cloth. It's a sort of misericord or hunting dagger. Look how thin the blade is. Will took it. The blade was indeed thin, ending in a handle made of polished bone. The blade and hilt both were stained with dried blood. With a frown he wiped the flat of the knife across the rough fabric of his sleeve, scraping it clean until a symbol, burned into the blade, became visible. 2 serpents, each biting the other's tail, forming a perfect circle. Ouroboros, James said. Jem said, leaning in close to stare at the knife. A double one. Now, what do you think that means? The end of the world, said Will, still looking at the dagger, a small smile playing about his mouth. And the beginning, Jem frowned. I understand the symbology, William. I meant, what do you think its presence on the dagger signifies? The wind off the river was ruffling Will's hair. He brushed it out of his eyes with an impatient gesture and went back to studying the knife. It's an alchemical symbol, not a warlock or downworlder one. That usually means humans, the foolish mundane souls who think trafficking in magic is the ticket for gaining wealth and fame. The souls who usually end up a pile of bloody rags inside some pentagram. Jem sounded grim. The sort who like to lurk about the downworld parts of our fair city. After wrapping the handkerchief around the blade carefully, Will slipped it into his jacket pocket. Do you think Charlotte will let me handle the investigation? Do you think you can be trusted in downworld? The gambling hells, the dens of magical vice, the women of loose morals? Will smiled the way Lucifer might have smiled moments before he fell from heaven. Would tomorrow be too early to start looking, do you think? Jem sighed. Do what you like, William. You always do. Southampton, May. Tessa could not remember a time when she had not loved the Clockwork Angel. It had belonged to her mother once, and her mother had been wearing it when she died. After that, it had sat in her mother's jewelry box until her brother, Nathaniel, took it out one day to see if it was still in working order. The angel was no bigger than Tessa's pinky finger, a tiny statuette made of brass, with folded bronze wings, no larger than a cricket's. It had a delicate metal face with shut crescent eyelids and hands crossed over a sword in front. Excuse me. A thin chain that looped beneath the wings allowed the angel to be worn around the neck like a locket. Tessa knew the angel was made out of clockwork because if she lifted it to her ear, she could hear the sound of its machinery, like the sound of a watch. Nate had exclaimed in surprise that it was still working after so many years, and he had looked in vain for a knob or a screw, or some other method by which the angel might be wound, but there had been nothing to find. With a shrug, he'd given the angel to Tessa. From that moment, she had never taken it off. Even at night, the angel lay against her chest as she slept. Its constant tick-tock, like the beating of a second heart. She held it now, clutched between her fingers, as the Maine nosed its way between other massive steamships to find a spot at the Southampton dock. Nate had insisted that she come to Southampton instead of Liverpool, where most transatlantic steamers arrived. He had claimed it was because Southampton was a much pleasanter place to arrive at, so Tessa couldn't help being a little disappointed by this, her first sight of England. It was drearily grey. Rain drummed down on the spires of a distant church, while black smoke rose from the chimneys of ships and stained the already dull-colored sky. A crowd of people in dark clothes, holding umbrellas, stood on the docks. Tessa strained to see if her brother was among them, but the mist and spray from the ship were too thick for her to make out any individual in great detail. Tessa shivered. The wind off the sea was chilly. All of Nate's letters had claimed that London was beautiful, the sun shining every day. Well, Tessa thought, hopefully the weather there was better than it was here, because she had no warm clothes with her, nothing more substantial than a woolen shawl that had belonged to Aunt Harriet, and a pair of thin gloves. She had sold most of her clothes to pay for her aunt's funeral, secure in the knowledge that her brother would buy her more when she arrived in London to live with him. A shout went up. The Maine, its shining black-painted hull, gleaming wet with rain, had anchored, and tugs were plowing their way through the heaving gray water, ready to carry baggage and passengers to the shore. Passengers streamed off the ship, clearly desperate to feel land under their feet. So different from their departure from New York. The sky had been blue then, and a brass band had been playing, though with no one there to wish her goodbye. It had not been a merry occasion. Hunching her shoulders, Tessa joined the disembarking crowd. Drops of rain stung her unprotected head and neck like pinpricks from icy little needles, and her hands, inside their insubstantial gloves, were clammy and wet with rain. Reaching the quay, she looked around eagerly, searching for a sight of Nate. It had been nearly 2 weeks since she'd spoken to a soul, having kept almost entirely to herself on board the Maine. It would be wonderful to have her brother to talk to again. He wasn't there. The wharves were heaped with stacks of luggage and all sorts of boxes and cargo, even mounds of fruit and vegetables wilting and dissolving in the rain. A steamer was departing for Le Havre nearby, and damp-looking sailors swarmed close by Tessa, shouting in French. She tried to move aside, only to be almost trampled by a throng of disembarking passengers, hurrying for the shelter of the railway station. But Nate was nowhere to be seen. "You are Miss Gray?" The voice was guttural, heavily accented. A man had moved to stand in front of Tessa. He was tall, and wearing a sweeping black coat and a tall hat, its brim collecting rainwater like a cistern. His eyes were peculiarly bulging, almost protuberant? Yeah, that's the way you say that, protuberant, like a frog's. His skin as rough-looking as scar tissue. Tessa had to fight the urge to cringe away from him, but he knew her name. Who here would know her name except someone who knew Nate, too? "Yes? Your brother sent me. Come with me. Where is he?" Tessa demanded, but the man was already walking away. His stride was uneven, as if he had a limp from an old injury. After a moment, Tessa gathered up her skirts and hurried after him. He wound through the crowd, moving ahead with purposeful speed. People jumped aside, muttering about his rudeness as he shouldered past, with Tessa nearly running to keep up. He turned abruptly around a pile of boxes and came to a halt in front of a large, gleaming black coach. Gold letters had been painted across its side, but the rain and mist were too thick for Tessa to read them clearly. The door of the carriage opened, and a woman leaned out. She wore an enormous plumed hat that hid her face. "Miss Teresa Gray?" Tessa nodded. The bulging-eyed man hurried to help the woman out of the carriage, and then another woman following after her. Each of them immediately opened an umbrella and raised it, sheltering themselves from the rain. Then they fixed their eyes on Tessa. They were an odd pair, the women. One was very tall and thin, with a bony, pinched face. Colorless hair was scraped back into a chignon at the back of her head. She wore a dress of brilliant violet silk, already spattered here and there with splotches of rain, and matching violet gloves. The other woman was short and plump, with small eyes sunk deep into her head. The bright pink gloves stretched over her large hands made them look like colorful paws. "Teresa Gray," said the shorter of the two. "What a delight to make your acquaintance at last. I am Mrs. Black, and this is my sister, Mrs. Dark. Your brother sent us to accompany you to London." Tessa, damp, cold, and baffled, clutched her wet shawl tighter around herself. "I don't understand. Where's Nate? Why didn't he come himself? He was unavoidably detained by business in London. Mortmains couldn't spare him. He had a note for you, however." Mrs. Black held out a rolled-up bit of paper, already dampened with rain. Tessa took it and turned away to read it. It was a short note from her brother, apologizing for not being at the docks to meet her, and letting her know they trusted Mrs. Black and Mrs. Dark. I call them the Dark Sisters Tessie for obvious reasons, and they seemed to find the name agreeable, to bring her safely to his house in London. They were, his note said, his landladies as well as trusted friends, and they had his highest recommendation. That decided her. The letter was certainly from Nate. It was in his handwriting, and no one else ever called her Tessie. She swallowed hard and slipped the note into her sleeve, turning back to face the sisters. "Very well," she said, fighting down her lingering sense of disappointment. She had been so looking forward to seeing her brother. Shall we call a porter to fetch my trunk? No need. No need. Mrs. Dark's cheerful tone was at odds with her pinched gray features. We've already arranged to have it sent on ahead. She snapped her fingers at the bulging-eyed man, who swung himself up into the driver's seat at the front of the carriage. She placed her hand on Tessa's shoulder. Come along, child. Let's get you out of the rain. As Tessa moved toward the carriage, propelled by Mrs. Dark's bony grip, the mist cleared, revealing the gleaming golden image painted on the side of the door. The words "The Pandemonium Club" curled intricately around two snakes biting each other's tails, forming a circle. Tessa frowned. What does that mean? Nothing you need to worry about. Nothing you need worry about, said Mrs. Black, who had already climbed inside and had her skirts spread out across one of the comfortable-looking seats. The inside of the carriage was richly decorated with plush purple velvet bench seats facing each other and gold-tasseled curtains hanging in the windows. Mrs. Dark helped Tessa up into the carriage, then clambered in behind her. As Tessa settled herself on the bench seat, Mrs. Black reached the shut carriage door behind her sister, closing out the gray sky. When she smiled, her teeth gleamed in the dimness as if they were made out of metal. Do settle in, Teresa. We've a long ride ahead of us. Tessa put a hand to the clockwork angel at her throat, taking comfort in its steady ticking as the carriage lurched forward into the rain. Okay, so the prologue basically prepares us for what it is that we're going to be dealing with and the characters that we end up meeting first. We end up meeting Will and Jem first. Now, Jem, as we all know, Jem later on becomes Brother Zachariah, who we already met in the Mortal Instruments. We met him first in City of Fallen Angels, and then we meet him, the actual version of him, Jem Carstairs, the actual Jem, after Jace cures him using Heavenly Fire. We meet him in City of Heavenly Fire. And that was also when we ended up meeting Tessa for the first time. Now, I didn't end up reading City of Lost Souls and City of Heavenly Fire on this channel, but if you guys have read those books, you would know that that is where you meet officially Tessa and Jem. And you learn that Tessa was actually the warlock whom Jocelyn Fairchild had hired to perform the protection ritual on her daughter, Clare. And she grew to have such a deep liking for Tessa that she combined her surname Fairchild with Tessa's surname Grey and created the name Frey, and sort of named Clare after Tessa in a lot of ways. But this book actually explains a lot of their history and how Tessa is connected to the Herondales and the Carstairs in more ways than one. And we learn about her particular connection between the Herondales and also the Lightwoods. And you learn how and why the Lightwoods and the Herondales are distantly related to each other thanks to Will as well as Gabriel Lightwood. And you learn a lot of interesting things throughout the series. You learn that despite Alec and Jace actually being parabatai, Will Herondale and Gabriel Lightwood absolutely despised one another. In fact, Will's nickname for Gabriel was actually Gabriel Lightworm. Gabriel Lightworm. I can never get past that, actually. But more or less, that is where you see all of it. You see how they sort of put aside like that type of rivalry, and they actually end up becoming family, and they find family in one another. And I think that that's one of the most special things about these books, is that it really is about this idea of like found family in a lot of ways. Because when you find such a tight-knit group of friends, you really begin to think of them kind of like family, and they're family that you choose. That isn't family by blood, especially if you have no more blood family left in your life. And that is such a special thing about parabatai bonds. But Will and Jem, you definitely do see that here. They are parabatai, actually, because, like, even Will says, it's so annoying. Like, showing off killing a demon, and he has nobody to show off to. I mean, he definitely does have Jace's personality. Will Herondale is a little shithead. He really is. He's a little shithead, is the way that I describe him. But they describe him to more so have Alex looks than he has Jace's looks. So, you can definitely see a connection there. And they did announce that an Infernal Device television series is in the making for BBC. But I'm personally hoping that they find a way to connect it to the Shadowhunters television show that aired on Freeform, because it would be such a waste if they didn't use Harry Shum Jr.'s Magnus Bane in some capacity. And I personally think that a better way of doing it would be to have Tessa come to the New York Institute in modern day and have her past sort of explored through a series of flashbacks in particular, and we can have a lot of the other characters that were from her time period in that Victorian era come through in flashbacks as well as photographs. And personally, I think that Tessa should be portrayed by somebody a little bit more unknown. They should go out and they should find unknowns for her. But personally, for me, I find that her looks more so mirror mine. I mean, the oval face, the grayish type eyes, the long dark brown hair. I mean, those are looks of a woman that aren't necessarily considered, the most extraordinary. I mean, considering everything, you know what I mean? It's like women with the dark brown hair and everything, like I do, we're always kind of viewed as kind of ordinary in some way, I guess you could say, to a certain degree, because it's the most common hair color that one could have. Like, you always kind of want what you don't have. Like, I feel as though that is true for everybody. Dark-haired girls always either want to be redheaded or blonde because we're just never really necessarily content with what we've already got. And Tessa, she's very tall and doesn't really see herself as regal or extraordinary or beautiful in any capacity at all whatsoever. So, of course, with that is more or less kind of mirroring Clare in a lot of ways, where Clare doubts her looks in lots of ways, where she's very small, very delicate, very petite, flaming red hair, because red hair is the most uncommon hair color in the world. Like, the combination of red hair and green eyes is considered the rarest combination for somebody to have. And if you have red hair with green eyes, then you are considered to be one of those one-of-a-kind people. And that is definitely something. So I would say definitely, as far as like my piece of advice, like, just embrace your looks for what they are, because you can always color your hair in different ways. You can always do different things, but please, for the love of God, just embrace your physical appearance, your natural physical appearance as much as possible, like Tessa and Clare both had to learn to do. I mean, come on now. They're just like us, regular, ordinary humans, like you and me, that had to learn how to embrace their physical appearance and embrace their looks and learn how special and wonderful they really are, just like all of us. They put their shoe on one foot at a time, just like everybody else. But I can say that this prologue was definitely the most interesting that I've read, because it really just set up the time period that we're going to be immersed in, the Victorian era of England. And of course, I'm going to be tapping into my British accent as much as possible here, because, I mean, come on now, we're in London. How can I not, want to try out a British accent here and there? I mean, the only way that I ever really developed any kind of British accent was I would watch all the Harry Potter movies at the age of 7 or 8, and I would imitate Emma Watson. Every single way she would pronounce a word, every, tick to her accent, I would imitate it, and I would do it exactly the way she did it. So, yeah, that's the only way that I'm ever going to be able to manage the British accents in this book in particular. And I already know there's going to be some words that are going to be complicated for me to be able to pronounce, because, let's be honest, Clare, the way how she writes very intricately, and her writing is stunningly beautiful in how she manages to create such stunning details. But there are times where she uses vocabulary that's a little bit out of date, hard to understand. So, of course, I'm going to struggle through a lot of the Latin that's definitely in this book. You already know that Latin is going to be in these books, because everything is in Latin. Everything is in Latin. Then the spells, everything that they say, names of the runes that they have, the terms that they use, it's all in Latin. I struggled through a lot of the Latin when I read City of Fallen Angels on this channel. So, yeah, definitely I'm very excited for this book, because I'm pretty sure that we meet Magnus and we meet Camille Belcourt again. So, yeah, we get to see how Magnus is connected to the London Institute and his ties to the Herondales. And, yep, I'm really excited to continue reading it. So I hope you guys enjoyed the reading of the foreword as well as the prologue of the Infernal Devices, the Clockwork Angel. If you guys enjoyed, be sure to subscribe to the channel if you happen to be new, and leave a like on the video. And also, leave comments down below and let me know your thoughts and opinions on the readings that I do, because I do read every single comment that gets posted. And also, if you guys have read this series, let me know in the comments what your favorite character is in this series. I personally have a feeling that Tessa and Will are going to be two of my favorites, but I also know that two of my personal top favorites, Camille and Magnus, actually show up in this series. So I'm really, really excited. God bless, happy viewing, and have a nice day. See ya!